God is in control and He cares. That's a hard thing to take when we think of the horrible things that break into our life, sometimes all too often. But the Scriptures teach very clearly that God is in control and He does care for His people. Psalm 115 and verse 3, the Lord is in the heavens and He does whatsoever He pleases. Proverbs 16 and verse 4, the Lord has made everything for its purpose. Proverbs 16 and verse 9, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 19 and verse 21, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Romans 8 and verse 28, and we know that God works all things together for good to those who are the called according to His purpose. But then consider what we read in Psalm 146 and verses 8 and 9. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the sojourner and upholds the widow and the fatherless, but the way of the wicked He brings to ruin. God is in control and He cares. That means when there is either a hard providence or a happy providence in our lives, it is the Almighty that is behind it at all times. There is never a single thing in this universe, in your life, that is outside of the sovereign hand of God. This morning, I want you to see the sovereign hand of God. I want you to see that it is the sovereign hand of God that upholds all things in this universe. I want you to see, my dear friends, this morning, that it is the sovereign hand of God that is holding your life together. It is that sovereign hand that is like no other hand in the universe. But I have to confess, it's hard to see the effects of that sovereign hand. We can be so blinded by the tears of grief, the debris of disaster, the dust that rises up from the avalanche of adversities. In the midst of such difficult situations, it is hard to see the effects of the sovereign hand of God. But it's there. I mentioned to us last week when we studied Ruth chapter 1 that we call this the doctrine of divine providence. I remind you that the doctrine of divine providence teaches that God's sovereign purpose reaches all people, all particulars, and all places. Nothing is missed. And it's only when we stop, and often we have to look back to see this in hindsight, that the signature of the sovereign hand of God is on everything. That includes the hard providences and the happy providences. This is what introduces me and us this morning to Ruth chapter 2. The book of Ruth is the record of an epic story. It is a beautiful story. It is a story that contains records of hardships and difficulties. It is a story that has mention of romance. It's a story that fits into the overall arching narrative of all of the Bible that prepares us for the arrival of the greatest king of all, and that is King David. But from him would come the ultimate king, and that is Jesus Christ. This book, which, yes, is about people, is ultimately about our sovereign God. Any study of the book of Ruth that does not emphasize the theme of the sovereignty of God misses the point of this book. And what I want to introduce you to this morning is three characters. There are three characters mentioned by name in Ruth chapter 2. Two of them you have met already, Naomi and also her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Ruth, of the two of them, gets the big mention in this chapter. But there is a third character that we're introduced to. And I really love what the writer does in verse 1. He actually gives us a spoiler alert. He actually states in verse 1, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Boaz is the third character that we're introduced to. And what the writer wants you to see here is the tension that was at the end of chapter 1, in which Naomi and Ruth come back to Bethlehem in a situation in which they are at a huge disadvantage because they are both widows, they are in poverty, they are not in a position to gain wealth. They are unable to own the land that Naomi's late husband Elimelech had owned because of the cultural customs. They are at a huge disadvantage, and the writer wants you to see in chapter 2 and verse 1 that a huge change is coming. The resolution to the conflict is found in this man named Boaz. Now, we will come and talk about him in just a moment, but I want you to see the three characters. Ruth chapter 2 tells us about Naomi. It tells us about Ruth, and it also tells us about Boaz. But they are not the main characters of chapter 2. What is chapter 2 actually about? You need to look closely. But as you look carefully in your pondering, you will see the signature of a hand. The main character of Ruth chapter 2 is actually God. He is the one behind the scenes. The lesson in this passage is not how to find somebody if you're single, but there might be some good principles in this chapter. It's not about how to get the most out of your gleaning when you're in a field. Nor is it primarily about showing kindness to people, as applicable as those points are. The lesson of Ruth chapter 2 is this: the sovereign hand of God is always at work in the life of his people. And what we have in Ruth chapter 2 is three pictures of the sovereign hand of God working. And what I want you to see as we work our way through this beautiful chapter is that Ruth and Naomi didn't see it at the time. It was only as it began to unfold, as they began to look back, they could see that this event that happened came as a result of God's sovereign hand. This person that I met was an appointment from God, and this particular situation was from the Almighty. So as we work our way through Ruth chapter 2 this morning, I want you to see three aspects of the sovereign hand of God. What are they? Well, let me give them to you up front, because this is how the narrative flows. We see in verses 1 to 7 that the sovereign hand of God is surprising. Secondly, we will see in verses 8 through to 18 that the sovereign hand of God is supplying. And finally, in verses 19 to 23, we see that the sovereign hand of God is strengthening. So let's have a look at the signature of God's sovereign hand found in the events of this chapter. We begin in verse 2 with a deliberate reference. So I want you to always observe something. When you read a narrative in the Bible, when somebody is specifically given a name, you need to take notice of that name. Ruth here is called in verse 2 and in verse 21, Ruth the Moabite. The narrator is emphasizing the fact that she is an outsider. She has come from outside of Israel. She is from a pagan nation. But we know from chapter 1 that Ruth has made a profession of faith in Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is now her God. She is loyal to Yahweh. She wants to serve Him. She wants to be faithful to the one true God. She is now a child of the living God. But the author wants you to see that this is an unexpected person to be lavished with the sovereign hand of God in her life. We read that Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her daughter, "Go." Can you see how stunning this actually is? You remember the circumstances of Ruth? Back in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, we learnt that in just 5 verses, the bottom of life fell out for this family. Naomi's husband died, her sons died. Her sons did marry ladies, and for 10 years they were married and they had no children, so evidently there was another trial there of infertility. A very difficult situation. And as they began to make their way to Bethlehem, when God had visited His people and there was now food, Naomi told her 2 daughters-in-law to stay back because your prospects of your future are really dismal if you come. You're outsiders. You're going to stand a greater chance if you go home. Get married. Marry the local guys. It's going to be a lot easier for you. There's so many more advantages. And we know the story. Orpah reluctantly agreed, but Ruth said, "I'm going with you." Ruth has given up a lot. She has given up the potential of a marriage that would be a lot easier to undertake. She has given up all that is familiar to her in her life, in the place that she lived. And now she has gone to Bethlehem, and at her own initiative, notice that in this text, she says to her mother-in-law, "I'm going to go out and I'm going to get some food for us." This is an impressive woman, a woman of initiative, a woman of great productivity, a woman of great character. She is truly the virtuous woman. Now, we are told that as she goes out into the fields to get some grain, she set out in verse 3 and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. Now, in order for you to appreciate this, you need to understand something going on in the background. It was a cultural custom. It's described in the book of Leviticus and also Deuteronomy, where God had made a law. And the law was that if people had land and there was produce on that land, they were to reap it and take from it the fruit for themselves, but they weren't to take it all. Because there were some people in Israel who had immigrated from other places and come into the land and were in poverty. There were widows. There were those who were fatherless. And the law of God, filled with compassion, says to those who took all their fruit, don't take every bit of it, but leave some for those who were more vulnerable to come and to take of that. They had to work for it, but they were able to take it. It was theirs. This was a generous act of God, a generous provision. Kind of reminds me a little bit of what it's like in the kitchen sometimes. I wonder if any of you can relate to this. One of my favorite times in the kitchen is when a chocolate cake is being made and particularly icing is found inside the mixing bowl. Now, you're not allowed to taste it while it's being made, but what I like to do is get the bowl at the end and get the leftover bits, to lick the spoon, so to speak. But one of my problems is usually a few people in front of me in the line who get the bowl first. And by the time you get the bowl, there's nothing there. Believe me, I've tried, but there's nothing else there. The difference between that and what's going on here is that the Lord was not doing this to say they just get the scraps. He's saying this, I don't want you to just give them the scraps. I want you to actually leave a good portion for the people. There is a generosity in this provision. So evidently, Ruth knew about this law of God, and she said, I'm going to go and I'm going to make use of that provision, and I'm going to go and get some of the grain and bring it back so that we can be fed. She's got to go out. She's got to work hard. It's going to be a hot day. It is a very difficult situation for her. But I want you to see that in the midst of Ruth's initiative, in the midst of her faithfulness, there is a surprise to God's sovereign hand. The surprise is seen in two areas. First of all, God's sovereign hand shows its surprise in the people it appears to and the particulars it includes. You remember I said last time that the providence of God reaches all people and all particulars. And in order for us to see the sovereign hand of God, they're often the things that we have to actually look at. Do you ever stop and say, who are the people that God has brought into my life? What are the little things that have happened? It's then when we examine those things that we see the evidence of God's signature. Look at what happens in verse 3. She set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Did you see what that said? She happened to go to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Ruth has no idea who Boaz is. But what just seemed to be a happenstance, what just appeared to be a circumstance, a particular in life that you don't even stop and examine, the writer wants you to see that the fact that she went to that field and not that field was the signature of God's sovereign hand. God was moving in this in such a way that as she went about and made her decision, I'm going to go to that field and not that field, the Lord was guiding it. The providence of God, the sovereign hand of God was guiding, it was working. Just as it did in the midst of the hard providences of the previous chapter, so it is in this happy providence. She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, I don't want to go into great detail with this because we will look at this next time in chapter 3. But I have to introduce you to another custom. Because only when you understand this does this all make sense. The narrator wants you to see that she's not only in the field of Boaz, which is significant, but Boaz is a relative of Elimelech. And according to Leviticus chapter 25, there was a provision also in the law of God that if there was a vulnerable member of a family who had, a widow had lost her husband, there was to be a near relative in that family that was to see to it that she would not lose her property, that it would be redeemed, it would be purchased, and that land would stay in the family. It was the obligation placed upon this individual called a redeemer. Now, we'll learn more about that in chapter 3 because that's where the significance is seen. But I want you to see what the writer is preparing us for here. A few things that you just ignore. The writer wants you to see the surprising sovereign hand of God at work. Ruth just happened to have gone into the field owned by Boaz, who just happened to be a relative of Elimelech. Now, as she is in the field working hard and gleaning, we are introduced to this impressive man, Boaz. We are told in verse 4 that Boaz had come from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." I want you to see here something far more significant than a, "Hi everyone, g'day Boaz." The writer is using strategic language here. He is wanting you to see that Boaz is a God-fearing man. He is a man that loves the Lord. He sees God at the center of everything. He sees God as the one who blesses. He is a man that knows God, and he is a man that expresses the love of God to those around him. That is the emphasis of this greeting. But as Boaz comes into the field and sees all the people out there, servants of his, working, but also noticing those who are there picking up some of the grain, the more vulnerable, he notices a particular woman. Now I want you to see the surprise in this again. It's simply surprising that Ruth just happens to go to the field owned by Boaz, but it's also surprising that Boaz just happens to be there when Ruth is there. The guy's got no idea what's going on, nor does Ruth, but God does. The sovereign hand of God is orchestrating all of this. He would have Ruth go to that field at that moment. He would have Boaz go to that field at that moment. Sometimes we look at our lives and ask ourselves the questions, why am I here and why is this happening? But it's only afterwards we see that I was in that situation because this was the outcome. If I wasn't there, this could have been the horrible outcome. The surprising hand of God. As Boaz looks out, he says to the man in charge in the field, "Who is this young woman?" The young lady gains the attention of Boaz. The servant makes mention that she is the young Moabite woman. As soon as that was said, shows that there is already a reputation. How would this servant know about Ruth the Moabite? Well, you remember back in chapter 1 when Naomi had come back, everyone was stunned when they saw her. They said, "Is this Naomi? She really looks different." Because the last 10 years had brought so much tragedy into her life. And she then tells the story, "I left full, but I've come back empty." But the text emphasized that Ruth was with her. The stories were beginning to be spread and told that Ruth was that loyal daughter-in-law, the one who is now serving Yahweh, the one who has come to be in the midst of the people of God. So this servant emphasizes the fact that this is the young Moabite woman. She came back with Naomi from the country. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." She came and she's continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. She is a really hard-working girl. But that's why she's here, Boaz. Then Boaz looks at Ruth and engages her in conversation. "Now listen, my daughter," verse 8. "Do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." There is an interest now in the life of this young woman. Before we move to the second point, I want to remind us that the first thing we see in this scene is a surprise to God's sovereign hand. The surprise is seen in the way that God is going to lavish His grace in the life of an unexpected person, a person from Moab. We see the surprising hand of God in the particulars that this woman is going to be in the right place at the right time and will meet the right person. But now we're going to see, secondly, that the sovereign hand of God is also seen in the fact that He supplies. It's not only surprising the way that God often works in our lives, but God's sovereignty is seen in the way he supplies our needs. When we look back in our lives and something happens that many people would call a coincidence, we as the people of God are to say, no, it was the sweetness of providence. But I also want you to see that when we actually have provisions, that also is the signature of God's hand. I was reminded of an article written in Satire talking about a man who was going to argue that God did not exist. And it went on to say that this man used the very air that God had given him so that he could communicate such things. It's amazing with perspective that we can say that I have achieved this, I have accomplished that, but the reality is everything we have, even the breath that we breathe, is all supplied by God. And that's what we see in verses 8 through to 18. We see the sovereign hand of God supplies. And God will often choose to meet our needs through people. Whenever we question the sovereignty of God, whenever we are in the midst of a hard providence, we will always do well to ponder, who are the people that God has brought into my life? What are the things that I have? It is then we see the sweetness of God's providence. Boaz shows a particular interest in Ruth the Moabite. I want you to not go over there. I want you to stay in this field, and I want you to keep close to the young women in my field. I want you to glean here, he says. And then he goes on to say, let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. He's showing her such kindness. Now, some people will insert at this point, well, this is the beginnings of him trying to woo her, and he's simply being romantic. But I don't want to jump into the romance yet. I think there's something else going on in the text as to why Boaz is being so kind to Ruth. And the emphasis is seen in the fact that she's called a Moabite. Why is Boaz lavishing her with such kindness? I think the clue is found in who Boaz's mum is. Who is the mother of Boaz? It was a lady by the name of Rahab. Rahab knew what it was to be an outsider. She knew what it was to live a lifestyle that was viewed with disdain. But Rahab, who was a prostitute, had embraced the one true God of Israel and had housed the spies sent from Joshua. And as the Lord had brought the walls of Jericho come crashing down, he preserved the household of Rahab. And Rahab married a man by the name of Salmon, and Rahab and Salmon, now in the covenant community of God's people, a woman who has repented and left her old lifestyle, has now come in and has given birth to a son, and his name is Boaz. The boy Boaz knows what it is to be raised by a lady that has been lavished by the goodness of God. It so gripped this young boy's heart. He has grown up to be a man of integrity, and when he sees this Moabite who has shown such loyalty and kindness to her mother-in-law in the name of the one true God, that gets the attention of this man. Now look, I did say this passage is not about how to meet people in your singleness, but I can't help but see a great principle here. The most attractive thing to a man of God and the most attractive thing to a woman of God is that the other individual is sold out for the Lord. I know the temptations of the world. Look outside the church. Do what is easy. Fulfill your lust of your flesh. But look at Ruth. She gave up so much so that she could honor Yahweh. And she was prepared to give up prospects that could have come so easily. And if she did, she would have missed out on Boaz. But look at Boaz. He is captured by the godliness of this woman. This is Ruth the Moabite, you say? The woman that was loyal to her mother-in-law? The woman that left all so that she could serve Yahweh? Lavish her with goodness. This is what happens in the text. After Boaz begins to show such kindness, Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband, has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." Now listen to verse 12, and I believe this is the key text that summarizes the whole book of Ruth. "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth, you left all and found safety in the Lord. And he now says, may you find warmth and blessings under those wings. Little did Boaz know that he is actually going to be the man that God is going to use to give her that warmth under those wings. We'll learn about that next time. But Boaz here is saying, may God bless you for honoring him. She responds, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And then what happens in verses 14 down to verse 18 is Boaz says, "Come, I want you to have a meal with all the other servants, and I want you to eat as much as you can. Satisfy yourself, Ruth, eat as much as you can. All the grain is yours." And we are told that she eats until she is satisfied. And not only that, he says, "I want you to have access to the best parts of my field when you come back and glean." And not only that, he whispers to his servants, "And I also want you to drop a few things on the ground in front of Ruth so that she can pick them up and take them as well." He really is showing appreciation for her. But what's actually happening to Ruth here is God is supplying her needs through a person. Every time we are given what we need and more, remember that is the signature of the sovereign hand of God. In a materialistic age, we tend to think, no, it's my right. No, I've earned it. But remember, everything you have comes from the sovereign hand of God. That's what the narrator wants us to see here. Ruth is receiving these blessings because God is using a person to supply her needs and more. The word satisfied is repeated twice. She is satisfied, and he loads her up with a doggy bag. But it's actually a pretty generous doggy bag because it's got enough food to last for a week for 2 people. Now, this is what brings us to the final point, and that is the sovereign hand of God is strengthening. Have a look at the text. Verse 19. "And her mother-in-law said to her when she got home, 'Where did you glean today?' She looks at her, thinks, a week's supply of food? I thought you'd just bring enough home for dinner. Where did you glean today? Where have you worked?" She clearly knows that she's been blessed. Who did this to you? Who lavished you with such kindness? Who blessed you, Ruth? And Ruth says, Naomi, she says, "The man's name I work with today is Boaz." The mention of Boaz does something to Naomi. She suddenly remembers something that she probably didn't think about in the midst of her grief. She states in verse 20, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living and the dead." God has not forgotten us, Ruth. God has remembered us. This is the same lady that said, "God has taken everything away from me. I'm empty." Now she's saying, "Ruth, do you know what this means? God has remembered us. He is still in our lives. He is working here." She goes on to say, The man is a close relative of ours. He's one of our redeemers. He actually has the opportunity to look after us. We aren't going to be left without any hope in the end. But what I want you to see here and not miss it is this. The signature of the sovereign hand of God is seen in that he actually strengthened Naomi's faith. You think of those times where God brings a person into your life and they just say something. Perhaps you see an example in somebody else. Maybe you listen to a sermon, you're in a Bible study group, or a unique scenario just comes and it lifts you up. That's the signature of the sovereign hand of God. He hasn't forgotten his people. He hasn't forgotten you. He is working every time you're strengthened, every time there is a glimmer of hope. That's the hand of God. He's working. He's working in your life. And this is what he was doing for Naomi and Ruth. As a result of this, Naomi declares, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This text teaches us, very importantly, that God is in control and he cares. The sovereign purpose of God reaches every person, particular, and place. The providential dealings of God sometimes will be classed hard providences, and there will be trials, and there will be suffering. But the providence of God will also express itself in happy providences. And in order for us to find comfort in the midst of hardship, we need to do what Boaz said Ruth did, and that is found in verse 12. We need to find comfort under the wings of God. Are you finding safety under the wings of God? The story is told of a farm barn that burnt down. It was a tragedy. The farmer couldn't do anything to stop it. The very next day, he went out and looked at the rubble, kicking all the items around, looking at everything destroyed and burnt and black. As he began to move the mess, he noted a particular lump on the ground. As he came closer and dusted some of the ash away, he noticed it was a burnt-up mother hen. Seems strange because normally a bird would fly away, or at least run away. But he noticed it moving. And as he lifted up the dead hen, there were these baby chicks underneath alive. They found safety under the wings of the mother hen. And Boaz said, "Ruth, you have found safety under the wings of Yahweh." Let us remember that there is a comfort to those who find their safety under the wings of the Lord.